For accessibility reasons, I would like to begin with a visual description. My name is Sinéad Burke. I'm a white, cisgendered woman who uses the pronouns she and her. I'm visibly disabled. I am a little person. I have brown, shoulder-length hair, and I'm wearing a full-length black dress that has cream sleeves and is decorated with the Gucci logo. No, really. I live in a body that is continuously observed, and people's assumptions of me and what I can do is shaped and has been molded by the stories you have commissioned, written, produced, and broadcast. Some of those stories have rooted me in a powerful community and gave me permission to imagine an equitable future. But other stories positioned me on the margins and gave strangers permission to laugh, stare, cause harm, and exclude. The black, queer, feminist poet Audre Lorde once said, "The master's tools won't dismantle the master's house." If you are in this room, it's likely you're in a position to dismantle the foundations. I'd like to give you some tools so we can rebuild together. I'm the founder of a company called Tilting the Lens. We ask, is this accessible, and work with disabled people to build and create solutions. But what is accessibility? Yesterday and this morning, we heard from the CEOs and senior leaders of public service broadcasters. Each of them spoke of the need and the urgency to expand their digital presence, to strengthen relationships with advertisers, and to connect with a younger generation. Podcasts were mentioned a lot too. But not one spoke of the need or an interest in prioritizing digital accessibility, an opportunity that is being harnessed by the streaming platforms that so many of you are in competition with. Apple TV has excellent audio descriptions. Netflix and YouTube continue to invest and exhibit excellence in captioning. But even with these innovations, non-disabled people are prioritized, because accessibility is not automatic, it is hidden in the settings. This session opened with a video from Vanessa Kingori, the publisher of British Vogue. It was different to every other video that was played at this conference. Did you spot it? It was captioned. Did you notice that it was captioned? Accessibility and universal design are inextricably linked. For example, by captioning content, we are not just supporting the deaf community, but encouraging a whole room of rowdy TV execs to engage with content whilst they cannot hear it. We also increase our audience engagement because the audience can watch our content without headphones. And for those who do not speak English as a first language, it creates a bridge to your work. So why do we continue to be in this phase of awareness rather than action? We live in an ableist world. The fabric of our society is threaded with the notion that disabled people are less. How do I know this? In February 2021, the Office for National Statistics reported that in 2020, disabled people counted for 6 in every 10 COVID deaths in England. In numbers, this means that of the 50,888 deaths between January and November, 30,296 of them were disabled people. And still, there were no sign language interpreters at COVID press briefings, nor at this conference. The pandemic must be an experience that we learn and rebuild from. Jack Thorne's McTaggart lecture will be etched in the history of this decade. If you haven't watched it yet, you must. Powerfully and with great urgency, he spoke to the systemic exclusion of disabled people in this industry. Many of you, and your colleagues, from watching that talk, made commitments and brokered partnerships to resource programs to build inclusion. Jack's powerful, memorable McTaggart has shone a revealing light onto the extent of the challenges faced by disabled creatives, said a press release. They're correct. And Jack does have a lived experience of disability, but he does not identify as disabled. I applaud and admire Jack, and I'm grateful to him. But what does it say about this industry that you make commitments and find resources not when disabled creatives speak about our challenges, but when someone speaks about our challenges for us? What hope is there that the pathways that you are building are truly accessible and equitable? Why would we apply when the invitation was crafted about us and for us, not with us? We need to rebuild. We want to give you some tools, which is why this panel exists. Today, I have the great privilege of being joined by 3 extraordinary people, some of whom, all of whom, I hope you know of. Brighton Williams is a baker and presenter who came fourth in the 2018 series of the Great British Bake Off, becoming the first visibly disabled baker in the tent. She does not have a soggy bottom, I'm led to believe.
That's what you think.
Well, that is for the after show. Alicia Dalrymple is a senior production secretary at Dragonfly. Her career in TV spans almost a decade, working with the BBC and Channel 4. She is also an important and keen mental health advocate. And David Proud is an actor, writer, director, and consultant. As a wheelchair user, he thought that having a disability meant that he would never act. But over the last 15 years, he's forged an extraordinary career and recently picked up an NTA. No big deal. But in order to think about what the solutions are, I think we must first assess and audit the presence. I want to start by hearing everybody's experiences in the industry and would love for them to begin by creating a very brief visual description of themselves. Briony, I'm coming to you first.
Okay, brief, gotcha. Okay. I am a 36-year-old cis white female. I'm wearing a pink dress with white flowers on it. I have no fingers on my left hand. And I'm wearing some really nice leopard print trainers.
Yeah, they're great. I was
Thanks.
hoping to swap shoes earlier, but it didn't work out. I was disappointed. You were the first visibly disabled baker in the tent. What was that experience like?
It was strange because growing up, I never identified as disabled. My mum absolutely hated the word. I was born in 1984. It was a dirty, dirty word, so my mum wouldn't use it, and I was very much, taught that if I couldn't do something, figure out a way to do it. So when I went on Bake Off and they started talking about me as me being disabled, I was very uncomfortable, if I'm honest. And my mum was uncomfortable. My family were like, why are you talking about yourself as disabled all of a sudden? But actually, what Bake Off has done for me is help me embrace that term and embrace my disability and be proud of it. I was the first visibly disabled baker in the Bake Off tent. And I had this panic when one of the producers rang me and said, I'm at the press conference and they want to label you the disabled baker. And I was like, no, can't I just be the Bristol baker? But since then, what I've realized is that it's an incredible platform for me to have been on. And now I get messages from people with young children who have hands like mine or, missing limbs saying, I'm so glad I saw you on Bake Off because now I know my kid's going to be okay. And it's so powerful. And now I say, yeah, damn straight, I am disabled. And I am proud of it, and it doesn't have to be a dirty word.
And that moniker, going back to what you were talking about in your past and your mum, I imagine being nervous for you in attaching that label. We need to transform how we think about disability, and content and representation on screen and behind the screen is so important and integral to that. Alicia, speaking of behind the scenes, that's very much where you're rooted. And your advocacy around mental health and mental illness is so important. But I wondered if you could talk me through your experiences. And first, I need to remember my own accessibility rules to give us a visual description of yourself. But talk me through your experiences then in the industry.
Visual description, black female with shoulder-length curly twists, gold hoops, black trousers, leopard print top. My experience, so I work in production management, And for a long time, production management has always been on the back burner in terms of well-being, because they're the people there that make sure that everybody else is okay. And sometimes that means our working hours are excessive, exhausting, and unfortunately, I've been at companies where well-being for production wasn't filtered down through management, which took a toll on all of production, not just me with my disability. So yeah.
And it's so important that when we think about accessibility, and when we think about the cultures we want to create, not just in this industry, but in individual companies, that requires sponsorship from leadership, but can't exist at that level alone. It requires a grassroots and a grass top approach, but never has conversations around accommodations and mental health been more important in thinking about the pandemic. What do you think, Alicia, would have been a positive accommodation or something that would have helped that situation for you?
It has to come from higher up. It has to filter down, because they are, even a majority of people in this building are probably the most senior people I've ever come face to face with. A lot of people left earlier, but I think it's very important that anybody with mental health, it could happen to anybody. A lot of people during COVID has said how much they've experienced mental health, how much they haven't coped, but then there's also people that have been living with that for their entire lives. And 55% of people in film and TV have contemplated suicide. That's over half. If you are the representations of TV, that's over half this room. It needs to be filtered down. There's nothing wrong with having a balanced work life, you know? It's an empathy and understanding as well, because everybody goes through something different. Once people are in the office, they have whole other lives.
And for us to realize that mental health and mental illness fits comfortably in the categorization of disability. It is an invisible disability, but for so long, we haven't even had a conversation surrounding mental health, and now what we've done is segregated the two and provided accommodations for some, but not all. But when we think about universal design, this has value for everyone. Whether you're a parent, whether you're caring for an older relative, this flexibility in how we work accommodates everyone. David, I have been rudely sitting with my back to you, but you did get to admire the back of the dress, so you're welcome. You initially had your doubts when you were starting in the industry that your disability and being physically disabled and very visible to this audience and many others would be an inhibitor to your role, potential role as an actor. I'd love for you to tell me a little bit about that experience and potentially how it's changed.
Yeah, and I'll describe myself as well. So I'm a white, quite geeky male in a wheelchair with a grandad cardigan and wearing some trousers that I had to buy the next size up because of lockdown. So I'll just
They're great trousers, though.
Yeah, safe space. I'll share. I didn't see anyone with a disability on screen, and I always wanted to do it. I begged my drama teacher to play Tiny Tim, and she said no because they'll think that I asked you. And it's just the passion was always there, but the roots into the industry weren't. And I've been very lucky to have a career that's been on screen and off screen. And I think the overwhelming thing over the last kind of couple of years that I've found is that advocacy was a huge part of what I was doing. And I was kind of more of an advocate than a content creator. And that had happened kind of organically over the years because of lack of opportunity. So now I think I need to flip that switch and say, no, I'm a content creator who does a little bit of advocacy. So there has been a change, but there's many barriers on screen and there's many barriers off screen. And I even had a senior commissioner say two years ago, there's no market for disability, even though, you know, the amount of awards and things that have been won from, by people portraying disability. But when we want to actually say the narrative ourselves and tell our own story, it becomes niche, and I don't buy that. So I think trickle-down economics arguably doesn't work, but trickle-down diversity does. And I think you need to have people on the boards and senior levels for it all to trickle down.
Yes, disability is a medium by which non-disabled actors exhibit the depth of their talent.
Yeah.
But when it's us,
it's niche.
And charitable.
Yeah.
I want to ask you for an example, if you don't mind, David. You were talking about the need for advocacy, and not to speak for those who are in the room, but I wonder if you could give us an example of what that advocacy is, because not everybody may be aware of the burden that often disabled people or any marginalised voice may have to experience in a situation like that.
Well, it's an energy thing. Because of my disability, I have enough energy to do the job that I'm trying to do, not to fight to get the job and then do the job. And it's an unfair burden on disabled artists to have to educate people while they're also working and to fight for the job. That burden isn't there for non-disabled artists. It shouldn't be there for us.
We have to quantify our validity
Yeah.
after passing all of the tests.
Yeah, and if the marker was to do 2 short films before you do the feature, I've had to do 4. Because the unconscious bias is that disability is weak. Are you going to give $1 million to that person that you've spent your entire life thinking is weak? No, you're not, unless they really overly prove themselves. So, and it's kind of unfair, and it needs to stop.
Absolutely. I want to think about the progress that has been made, because I think it's important that we each audit from our own individual lived experiences. Again, thinking of disability being a spectrum and a cacophony of different voices. But in terms of the progress that has been made, Briony, when we were talking yesterday, my background's in teaching. I'm actually not a TV exec, don't tell anybody. But when we were talking earlier, we were talking about the importance of representation at the most junior levels, because in thinking about the ways in which we shape the future of our society, if we don't see representation of every different type of person at the youngest of ages, we are setting ourselves up for failure and increasing challenges as we move through the system. And I just want you to talk to me about the normalising of disability, particularly in around children's content.
Yeah, I mean, when you look back to when I was a kid, there was no one with a disability on screen. Then, you go to the 2000s and they put the Lady Claire who had half an arm on CBeebies, and parents were in absolute just uproar about the fact that they could put someone like that on the telly and how it was scaring the children. And now you look now and you turn on children's TV. I have a 6-year-old, so I have a reason for doing that. Not just watching it tumble for the hell of it. And there is a lovely variety of people on screen. There could be more. But what I find is when I watch something with Nora, and there's somebody who has a disability or who looks different to her, it sparks a conversation, or I let it spark a conversation. So, she saw somebody who had a prosthetic leg the other day, and she turned to me, because we'd had the conversation before, after seeing someone on TV with a prosthetic leg, said, "Oh, Mummy, that person's got a prosthetic leg." She didn't go, "Oh, that person's not got no leg." She knew what a prosthetic was. She couldn't say it very well, but she tried. And it's because she's seen that, and it's so important for children. Without meaning to sound too preachy, they are our future. And if we are showing them what the world looks like in all its wondrous glory, then they will grow up seeing that and it being normal. I always do that, even though I don't, it's weird. I've always done it. They will grow up knowing that is how the world is and how it should be. So start from the bottom, because it will spark and, hopefully encourage conversations.
In those conversations that we have about the importance of representation, I think we often dwell on, and non-disabled audiences dwell on, the need to create awareness for non-disabled children so that they can have empathy. I think that's really important, but I actually don't believe it's the most fundamental reason why we need to push this forward. It is so that those children who are marginalised and othered feel that they belong.
Yeah.
And we have all been in positions, and I don't doubt many of you, because disabled people are 1 in 4 in British society, have felt that at some point. But in order to have that on-screen representation, there also has to be meaningful representation of disabled people behind the scenes. Not just in storytelling and in crafting, but at every element in order for the systemic change to occur. And Alicia, that's where you live as we spoke also. What do you think has left to be done in thinking about disability representation in post-production and in production?
A lot of stuff have been put in place. For example, mental health first aiders. Some companies offer external counselling, but then that's it. And even the access to the external counselling is not as easy as you think it would be. But at the minute, I'm at a company where the head of production she has an understanding of any ableism or disability or mental health, and it filters down. It's an important conversation to have. So I'm capable to work on one of the hardest shows to work on, and yet it be one of the best shows to work on, because they champion their team to be aware, to be open, to be, like forward thinking, basically.
And I think for an industry like this, looking at children's television and looking at invisible disabilities in production, often there is a nervousness or a fear of saying the wrong thing, doing the wrong thing. Where do we start? I often remember that I'm disabled when I'm in the supermarket because a child will find me and go, "Look, there's a little woman." You have all been in this situation. And the adult who is with them panics. And it's like, "Shh, shh." And the child is like, no, look, there's a little woman." And the adult is like, "Oh my God." And in that moment, they are mortified because they see it as a failure on themselves. How could my child do this if it is their child? They don't know what to say, so they say nothing. And as quickly as possible, they move that child out of the space around me and possibly out of that shop. And that's instructive because what they are telling that child is, I am not someone to look at, nor am I someone to speak to. And that is out of their own lack of awareness and comfort. Instead, what they should just do is go, "Yeah, that is a little woman. Why don't you say hello?" That, of course, places a responsibility on disabled people to facilitate conversations about who they are among the fruit, which is not great. But it does create change. And what happens in that conversation is the child is like, "Hi, my name is Sam." And I say, "Hi, my name is Sinead." And Sam is like, "Oh, you're boring." Which may or may not be true. I'm going to leave that for you to decide. But in the same way that we then sit in this discomfort around visible, invisible disabilities, where do we start? What about if we don't do the right thing? It's easier to just not do nothing. But let me give you a similar example. As a society, we have become very comfortable in asking people questions in some domains. I imagine there is quite a considerable number of you who are vegans. We do really well at asking people if they are vegetarian or vegan, and we accommodate for those needs. Why do we not ask not just disabled people, but everyone about if they have any access requirements, knowing that I think I saw somebody earlier who is momentarily disabled and on crutches? We need to become comfortable because if the onus is always on disabled people to ask for what we need, the gesture is charitable rather than rooted in rights. We were talking earlier about the Edinburgh TV Festival and Jack Thorne's incredible lecture where he said the TV industry has failed disabled people. I want to come to you, David. Would you agree with that based on your expertise? And what do you think needs to be done to solve that?
I would wholeheartedly agree with that. I think that only this year I started talking about the things that I've had to go through in, crawling to toilets on set, naked auditions so they could see my scars. And I actually did a talk at Ofcom and I broke down on this Zoom, which is a horrible thing to break down on a Zoom, because I'd never talked about it, because I didn't want to be trouble. And I think every disabled artist out there is carrying all of this baggage. So those things, those wins that the PR team have kind of put on and said, "Oh, we're doing this and we're doing that," behind a lot of that, there are some artists that have had to experience some serious trauma. And I'm considered one of the lucky ones in terms of a career. So I dread to think what other people that haven't been so lucky have experienced. And I think we have a duty of care just to do better. I think everyone knows what needs to be done. And there's just no excuses anymore. We just need to be doing better. It is a mental health issue. Everyone thinks about disability and they're all obsessed with physical health. My mental health has suffered more during my 15 years than my physical health.
But you have some solutions in mind in thinking about representation of disabled people at senior level leadership in broadcasters. I wonder if you could talk me through a couple of those ideas that you have. This is the place to start.
Yeah, I think if you need disabled people on your board, you need disabled people at your senior levels. I honestly think that without that, nothing will change. We've kind of got to a point where we've gone so far up the system. You also need to, if you're saying no to a disabled-led project, somebody else has to counter-check that decision, because I know projects that have spent 3 years in development and then just been thrown out with absolutely no reason. There must be accountability for commissioners. I know it's a taste thing, and I know you don't like accountability, but even just having your colleague check it all and go, would I make that same decision, could challenge your perceptions and how you feel about these projects. These disabled-led projects are rare. They're like little kind of glass things. We need to protect them, and we need to get them across the line, because if we don't get them in production, then in a year's time, we're not seeing them on the screen. And if you could greenlight everything on your desk that's got disability in today, we're not seeing it until next year. So we need urgent action.
And we talk a lot about the female gaze, the male gaze, going back to what's the conversations that happens in a room where commissions are made, what's the non-disabled or disabled gaze. I want to come to you, Briony, in thinking about this notion that the TV industry has failed disabled people. Do you agree?
I mean, I often don't feel like I'm disabled enough to speak for a lot of the disabled community, because I am blessed in that I don't have accessibility issues. I still have things that I have to deal with. And I think, representation has got better. But that's what people keep saying. It's got better.
Yeah.
But it's not good enough. That's the point. Yes, it's better, but we still need to keep going. And like David said, it needs to be now.
Yeah.
And we need to listen to stories like David's, because that's what's important, and that's what needs to change.
Alicia, you were talking about how even when the services exist, they are limited, or we spoke about yesterday that you can make an appointment with a mental health service, or they say that it's on demand, but it turns out that they are by appointment, and then it's almost too late. So in thinking about what needs to be done surrounding the failures of the television industry and thinking about disability, what would you suggest?
Well, I started at the Channel 4 production scheme as a production secretary, and it was on the year of Rio Paralympics. Mm-hmm. So there was a big push on people with disability. I'm now a junior production manager, and I'm sitting here having this discussion. So I think it's a case of keeping it at the forefront of people's minds. Broadcasters have to hold, or should hold, companies accountable for who they're hiring, where they're hiring them from, etc., because the talent is out there. And then in terms of external counselling, don't get me wrong, it is good.
Yeah.
It's good that it's offered. But there might be an instance where somebody might have really bad anxiety or might have sensory overload, and they might have to take a step back or take a break or take a breather. And sometimes that's even knowing that a room, for example, is accessible for somebody to do that.
And is available. Yeah.
And isn't a corner cupboard or something. Effort needs to be put in. And I know I keep saying this, but it is an empathy thing. Anybody could have a mental health disability. It doesn't have to come up now. You may never even experience it, but somebody close to you probably already has, or further down the line, a couple of years later, or, you know, it's thinking almost like what you would want
Yes.
to have in place in order to help you, for you to be your, well, say not your best person, but for you to be able to be seen just as good as everybody else.
And be safe,
And be safe, yeah.
because we're often forced to code switch. But I think you brought up a really important point. When we think about diversity within this industry and every other industry, we often measure success at entry level. We then don't chart how people are set up for success and how they thrive in the industry. So we congratulate ourselves, rightfully so, on the incoming class of diverse voices and perspectives. But we need to continuously audit, where are they now? Are there exit interviews that we can engage in to say, why did they fall through the cracks in the system? Was it because of a lack of interest or a lack of access? For this last question, I boldly asked the panelists to manifest what they want their career to look like in the next 3 years, because if there's any room that we could be in that could actually commission those ideas, it's this one. Because I think some of the greatest challenges that we have to on-screen and behind-the-scenes representation is that you have a limit to what you imagine we can do. So I'd like to expand that imagination. Briony, in 3 years, where do you want your career to be?
I'm coming for Lorraine. I'm joking. No, she's an institution, obviously. I'm not trying to dethrone Lorraine. But in my future, that's where I'd love to be, somewhere like that. You know, I love presenting. I relish my role on Food Unwrapped. You know, no pun intended. But I love it. I love talking to people. I love interacting with people. I love hearing their stories. So any experience where I can do that, you know, I love watching what Alice Hammond does, you know, and she came from Big Brother. It's, you know, it's amazing. So I think, you know, being on a regular spot.
And being the protagonist rather than being the cameo.
Being the protagonist rather than
guest.
being the side note.
Yes.
On something, you know, that's on regularly and...
Yeah, and without surprise and occasion. Alicia, 3 years, where do you want your career to be?
3 years, I would like to be PMing, I was going to say hard-hitting shows, but, you know, life's been hard-hitting. So PMing fun shows
Nice.
that nurture people.
And
Anybody.
that you can shape that culture from your own experience.
And I can absolutely shape that culture. You have to be in it to win it, and I'm in it.
Nice.
Thank you.
David, you have an NTA in your back pocket. Where would you like to be in 3 years?
I must say, not personally, it was Coronation Street, but it was a pleasure to write that episode. I would still like to be writing Coronation Street and killing off characters, because I love it. I would like to be known as an artist, not a disabled artist. I would like to win a BAFTA while my parents are still alive to see me do so. And I would like to retire as an advocate. I think I've done 15 years of panels, and this is a delightful one, don't get me wrong. But I kind of want to retire as an advocate and just make content. That's what I got into the industry to do. So it would be lovely if I can do that, knowing that the industry is in a better position now than what it was when I came into it.
This panel is delightful. But why do we have a disability panel when every issue is a disability issue? Why were we not spread across a program of 2 days, or the program of various different programs that you present? I cannot thank you all enough. This has been genuinely such an honor, and I'm excited, nervous, and slightly terrified that we all have to go to lunch with everybody after this. My hope is that they come up to each of you and go, here's my business card, I'd like to commission that idea. When are you available to start working? I welcome
Can I,
you to do
just
that.
as a side note, it's my daughter's birthday today, so I have to race off after this to get back to Bristol. But I'm on Instagram at Briony May Bakes, guys, if you want to get in touch.
She's done this before. Thank you for a genuinely thought-provoking and solution-driven conversation. I want to say that these solutions cannot be achieved overnight. I know that many of you in this room are at different stages of your journey, and some have continuously invested resources and created opportunities for disabled people. But before we go to lunch, I want us all to agree on some shared baseline propositions. The first, disability is not a dirty word. Say the word disabled. We are not superheroes. We are not differently abled. Our needs are not special. Disability is central to human existence. Disability can be visible and invisible. It can be inherited, acquired, permanent, or temporary. Disability threads across the intersections of identity. And if we think and talk about disability, it must be intersectional in its definition too. As has been discussed here today, we will each experience disability at some point in our lives. But until we culturally reposition disability, which is what you all have the power to do, we need it to be an existence that is not tied to sympathy and charity, but pride, creativity, and dignity. Until we do that, the notion that we will all be disabled is heard as a warning, rather than a call to action for community and alliance. The second, accessibility must be an explicit invitation, not an accommodation that must be reasonable. Because who decides what's reasonable? Accessibility must be embedded in our digital tools, our hiring practices, in our corporate office refurbishments, in our production budgets, and in our marketing strategies. Visibility is important, but it cannot be the measure of success. You said you want to win a BAFTA. We should not have an award ceremony celebrating the best of British film and television in a building that is inaccessible, where photographs are taken at the top of a flight of stairs. We should have deaf interpreters on stage with actors and directors and a ramp to the podium that can be used by everyone, and an accessible podium too. It is too late to think and plot accessibility when disabled talent has already reached the upper echelons of the industry, because who didn't make it due to the systemic barriers that we created? What does a young, disabled creative who is watching at home think? They believe that their inclusion would be an exception. These are the symbols that provoke us to believe that we are not welcome. Noting, of course, that accessibility is always more than physical accessibility. The third, the programs and initiatives that are currently being developed and implemented in relation to disability inclusion in television are impressive and important, but many of them don't acknowledge the wider societal barriers that exist. For example, we're currently in King's College in Cambridge, one of the most recognized and important educational institutions in the world. But regardless of my educational attainment and family affluence, I would find it really difficult to study or lecture here. The buildings are listed and architecturally protected. In my quest for inclusion, I am not asking you to place disabled people in roles that they are unqualified for. I'm asking you to acknowledge that the merit system by which we measure success is not designed for everyone to thrive. We do not just need programs that create opportunities for disabled talent now, but we need scholarships and bursaries that give access to education, and we need educational campaigns that encourage children and teenagers to believe that this is an industry that they can be part of. If our inclusion is only embedded in the present, change will be a moment, not a movement. The fourth, be a force for change. If you are participating in this conversation, it's most likely that you already have an interest in this work. I don't need to convince you of the business case, $1.7 trillion per annum, $8 trillion if you bring in their family and friends, or the creative opportunities that exist with inclusion. But this is the smallest attendance that I have seen of the 2 days of the conference. Where were your colleagues? As this session began, the audience became smaller. Now, maybe everybody who left is actually an expert in disability and accessibility. I should probably hire them. I need you to engage your colleagues. your families, and your friends about what you learned from today's discussion, arm yourself with 2 questions. Is this accessible? And who is not in the room? Because those questions free us from the passivity that we feel, and they force us to do something. I urge you to use the privilege and the power that is within your grasp to create accessible opportunities and to invite and value disabled people in your work. For too long, disabled people have been asked to sit on panels like this to expose the most vulnerable parts of our experience to build awareness. You are aware that we exist. We need action. And we need to be in the room. Thank you very much.